long ago, I made this video about how I was feeling burnt out with my Korean, and after honestly about a 1 or 2 year extended break with the language, I am finally this year getting back into my Korean studies. So in today's video, I thought I would share with you guys just exactly how I am learning Korean at the moment. Now, before I dive into all of the ways that I'm studying Korean now, I first wanted to talk about a little bit where my starting point was with Korean and what my goals were when I got started. Although I have been learning Korean for several years while living in South Korea, I feel like I had some big gaps in some of my skills, particularly speaking and pronunciation. Because unfortunately, I neglected to address these particular skills in my studying because I was under the impression that because I was living in South Korea, that was going to be more than enough. And the reality was, it wasn't. Plus, the reality is for so many foreigners who are living in South Korea, many of us still have to converse in English at work. And as a result, we don't get to practice Korean as much as we would like. So I personally noticed that my reading comprehension and my overall passive understanding of Korean was quite high, but my speaking level was quite low by comparison. That, and although my comprehension is quite high, I still feel like I have a lot to go in terms of vocabulary as well. So my goals with my Korean was to build my speaking and pronunciation skills and to spend a lot of time dedicated to vocabulary and listening practice as well. So one of the first things that I wanted to do was start to read a lot more books in Korean as a way to get more exposure to the language and build vocabulary. I found also that the more I read in Korean, then later my sentence structure also tends to improve as well. Plus, I'm just at a point where I have very little patience to study from a textbook, and I just wanted to learn a lot more Korean in a way that was more fun and organic. Now, getting started, it was way too challenging to read a book entirely extensively because there would just be huge chunks of the book that I just wouldn't understand. But then at the same time, reading it intensively would have been overwhelming because I could have easily found about 10 new words per page, and that was just way too much. So I kind of tried to find a balance of both of these extensive and intensive reading skills. Now, I previously made a video talking all about extensive reading and intensive reading and how I go about reading my first few books in another language. So if you guys are interested in learning more about that specifically, then I will put the video link either up above or down in the description box if you don't see it up here, so that you guys can go check that out if you're interested in learning more. But after reading my first 2 books in Korean, I feel that my ability to read extensively in the language is getting much better. So I'm trying to read more and more extensively and just really limit myself to only looking up about 4 words per page maximum. Ideally less. Now, if you're watching this and you're like, I'm not really at the level to start reading whole books in Korean, then I highly recommend to you guys the YONSEI reading textbook series. It's a great way to get reading practice in no matter what level you're at, and every passage in these books comes with an MP3 file, so you can also do shadowing and listening practice along with it. Also, I know that you can buy these books online, so I will put links to that down in the description box. I'm not sponsored, it's just so that you guys can easily find the resources. My goal is overall just to get a lot of reading practice in so that I can get a lot of exposure to natural Korean, to learn words and context, and to get lots of exposure to natural sentence structures. I figure I don't need to 100% break down everything in one single book. It's better to focus on reading extensively quite a few books over several months rather than just focusing on one, because it's likely that I'm going to come across a lot of the same words over and over. And I think that this will really help me internalize a lot of those new words as well as general sentence structures in the Korean language, which I do think will genuinely help me with my speaking and writing later on. Because as I say, if you want to be a better writer, you have to read a lot, and I would argue that this also translates to speaking as well. So one thing that I'm focusing more heavily on is just getting a lot of listening practice in. Since I started my current job, I noticed that my Korean listening comprehension just skyrocketed. And as a result, I started to notice that my speaking began to improve as well. Now, the reason for this is because I spend all day listening to people speaking in Korean nonstop. And although my job requires me to speak mostly in English, I am constantly listening to others conversing in Korean all around me all day nonstop. Now, what's nice about this versus me having a one-to-one conversation with someone is that these conversations aren't dependent on me to keep the conversation flowing. And as a result, I can just really observe how Koreans interact with each other and have a conversation in a natural environment. When talking one-to-one with someone, if I get stuck on my words, then that conversation comes to a halt. And that person might start to adjust how they speak in order for me to better understand them. And in adjusting how they speak, they kind of start to sound a little bit less natural. So I quickly realized that if I just started to focus more on listening practice, then my listening comprehension would improve as well as my vocabulary. I know it sounds really simple and really obvious, but it kind of just like hit me like, oh, duh, you just need to listen to more Korean. So now I'm trying to watch a lot more TV shows and film in Korean and forcing myself to only rely on Korean subtitles and just get used to not always understanding everything. Because my experience at work kind of taught me that although there might be gaps in what I'm able to understand, if I just keep going, somehow eventually these gaps will start to shrink. And as I listen more and more to Korean and I hear a lot of new words and expressions and different ways of putting ideas together in a sentence, I find that when I go to speak, a lot of these things are just magically popping out without me even realizing that I've learned them. Now, this is something that I've been talking about a lot lately in many of my videos, but I cannot stress it enough, you guys, because when I started studying Korean, I never really did any shadowing, and this is not something that I really did for most of the time that I was learning the language. But as I said earlier in this video, that I felt like I had a huge gap in my comprehension skills versus my speaking and pronunciation skills. And shadowing has been something that I've been doing a lot of in order to bridge this gap, and it's really been working. So now what I'm doing is I'm going through the Seoul University textbook that I have, and I'm going through all of the dialogues very slowly and just doing a lot of shadowing practice with those. This was a book that I was using alongside a tutor who was helping me build my speaking and pronunciation, and they had me doing a lot of shadowing practice for homework, and also in the class itself, we would do some reading aloud and they would correct my pronunciation. So basically, I'm just kind of continuing what I was doing in my classes alongside that book. And another thing that I'm doing is I'm actually going through the YONSEI reading textbook series at a lower level, and I'm just rereading the stories, but using them instead as shadowing practice. Before I get started with shadowing, I'll actually try to play the audio file and see how much of that story I can understand just from the listening alone. And then I will go through and do a ton of shadowing practice with that. And then afterwards, I will close the book and again, listen to the audio just to see like how much more I can understand without reading along with it by just listening. And something that I found really helps me is actually overemphasizing the pronunciation. Now, this is actually something I kind of learned in singing lessons that I took like years ago, but I actually find that it translates really well to pronunciation in language learning. Because essentially when you go to say something in your target language, you might think that you sound right, but then when you listen back to it, it kind of doesn't sound that great at all. But I found that when I really take the time to concentrate on how I'm moving my mouth and pronouncing the sound, when I'm basically thinking like, okay, I'm kind of exaggerating it, that's when it actually starts to sound correct. So when I'm going through my shadowing practice, I really take the time to do it slowly and steadily so that I can really concentrate on what I'm saying, how I'm making that sound with my mouth. So basically, I'm kind of trying to just focus on my articulation and getting that down rather than trying to focus on like how fast I can speak. Also, another random thing that I kind of picked up from guitar lessons years ago, this is a very like music inspired tip. My guitar teacher would always say that if you can do something slowly and accurately and you practice that over and over, then eventually you can actually play it quickly or like in the real time that it's supposed to be played. And I think that's kind of like the same thing that goes here. Like if you can speak slowly and articulate what you're saying really well and be very understood, then eventually, obviously, your speaking skills will get faster. Like your pace of speaking will get faster. And also, if you guys want to know more about how I go about shadowing in another language, I also made a video about that not too long ago, which I'll link it up here. If you guys don't see a link there, then just check the description box. I'll put it there for you if you guys want to learn more about that. The last thing that I'm doing is I'm actually going back through a lower level textbook and I'm just reviewing over grammar and vocabulary that I kind of already know, but with an emphasis more so on active practice of those concepts. Now, I mentioned that I was using this old SEOUL University textbook to do some shadowing practice, and that's essentially the book that I'm going through right now to review grammar, vocabulary, and I'm just taking my time doing all of the writing exercises, all of the speaking exercises, and focusing more on active practice, because I realized that while I know most of the grammar and vocabulary in this book, I never use it. So I kind of need to spend more time practicing it so that I can kind of add it to my active skill set. So my goal right now is to just go slow and steadily through this textbook because, one, I don't want to burn out. I mentioned earlier in this video that I was so burnt out with Korean that I didn't touch it for like almost 1 or 2 years. And I even made a whole other video about my experience with burnout. And two, I didn't really want to rush things because it's easy to just go fast through the materials and understand everything. But I need time to understand and to give my brain a chance to process and recall all of the things that it's learning and be able to then use it. I think in the past, I just went so hard and so fast with Korean that I learned a lot and my passive understanding of the language was great, but I didn't really spend the time to stop and focus on speaking and writing, which generally takes more dedicated time than just comprehension. And that's probably what led to me having these huge gaps in my understanding and my speaking skills. So now I focus on just doing a little bit each day and having fun in the process versus trying to cram and do so much all at once. Especially because I think speaking skills, pronunciation, and writing, they all take time to develop and they really can't be rushed.